Hi, I'm Ash from Catch 22 Productions. We've recently toured to schools with our production workshops of An Inspector Calls. To help support your pupils, we've got our actors to answer some questions you've been asking. If you have any questions you want answering, just ask your teacher. He or she can email us and we'll get the answer back to you. Remember Priestley's key themes: responsibility, social duty, cause and effect. These themes are so prominent in our world of COVID-19 today, and it is our duty to learn, to change, because we do not live alone. We are part of one body and we are responsible for each other. So, our first actor today is Richard. Richard, first question, does Gerald love Eva?
It's difficult because I think Gerald genuinely does have genuine affection for Eva Smith, although he won't admit it. He never admits it to himself. When asked directly whether or not he loves Eva Smith, he says, "It's hard to say. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me." And so, in a way, Gerald doesn't allow himself to admit to his own emotions. He doesn't allow himself to love Eva Smith openly.
Rich, you play Gerald. Do you think he's a hero or a villain?
Is Gerald a hero or a villain? That's a really difficult question to answer because he sits somewhere in between those two definitions. He's neither hero nor villain. He thinks of himself as a hero, and he likes to pretend that he's fulfilling that role. Sheila describes him as a fairy prince. And in many ways that's exactly what he is. He is a fairy tale character. He rescues Eva Smith from the palace bar and looks after her for a time, enjoys a romance with her. And yet when that romance is over, when reality kicks in, when it becomes inconvenient for him to continue to keep Eva Smith as his mistress, he ends the relationship, leaving her distraught.
Another question, Rich. Who is Arthur Birling?
Mr. Birling is the quintessential capitalist. He represents everything that J.B. Priestley thinks is wrong with capitalist society and capitalism in general. Mr. Birling hires women because they are cheap labour. In fact, that is a direct quote. Sheila says these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. But to Mr. Birling, that's exactly what they are. They are cheap labour. He hires them because they're disposable. He can get rid of them easily. Mr. Birling has the line, "There are several hundred young girls down there, and they keep changing." And they keep changing because when they become inconvenient, or if their labour becomes too costly for him, he can simply get rid of them. And Mr. Birling has no compunction about doing that. He is happy to get rid of anyone that stands in the way of him making more money. He's anti-strike action. He doesn't allow his employees to strike for better paying conditions. And that is the reason why he fires Eva Smith. Now, Priestley is saying that workers need to be paid a fair wage. Eva Smith goes on strike for wanting a very small increase in her wage in order to be able to live comfortably. And Birling refuses to do that because it would affect his profits. Now, Birling is a man who is incredibly wealthy. He has a wealthy household and he's able to employ servants. So there is very little reason why Birling couldn't take that financial hit in order to provide his workforce with a better standard of living. In fact, Eric, his own son, argues that he could quite easily have paid Eva Smith more money and given her her job back after striking against him.
Who is Eva Smith?
Who is Eva Smith and what does she represent? Eva Smith is every woman. J.B. Priestley deliberately gives her the name Eva Smith as a pun. Eve is the first woman in Christian theology, and Smith is the most common surname, or at least was at the time the play was written. And so by giving her that name, he's literally telling us that Eva Smith could be anybody. The inspector tells us that she had more than one name, and although that's true in terms of the narrative of the story, she does take on multiple names. It's also true that any person could be Eva Smith, and so she has more than one name, has a double meaning.
Who is Inspector Goole?
Who is Inspector Goole? J.B. Priestley's character of Inspector Goole is a character who is implied to be ghostly. He's implied to be supernatural in some way. His name is a pun on the word ghoul, Ghoul, whilst in the play his name is spelled Goole. The character is given this supernatural quality because it makes everything that he says have more value. By being a supernatural character, he's able to know things that he shouldn't. Now, an audience watching the play in 1945 would have knowledge of recent events, particularly the Second World War. And Inspector Goole makes reference to that war in his speech about fire and blood and anguish towards the end of the play. So by having this ghostly quality, he's given more credence to what he says. He's directly contrasted with Mr. Burling. Now, Mr. Burling has a speech near the beginning of the play where he makes predictions about the future, and almost all of those predictions fail to come true. So, by contrasting Mr. Burling, who we know is an unreliable source of information, with the Inspector, who we have an inkling is a supernatural character and has more value to what he says, J.B. Priestley is telling us that everything the Inspector says has more value than everything Mr. Burling says. And the Inspector represents Priestley's socialist ideas, his socialist voice in the play, whilst Mr. Burling is the voice of capitalism. So, as a writer, J.B. Priestley is telling us to embrace socialism and avoid the capitalist system that Mr. Burling values.
Final question, Rich. Why doesn't Gerald stay with Eva Smith?
It's important to remember that at the time Gerald Croft has his relationship with Eva Smith, both of them are fulfilling fairy tale roles. Eva Smith is going by the name of Daisy Renton, so she's acting out a part. She's playing the damsel in distress. Gerald Croft is acting out the role of the fairy prince. He's the knight in shining armour. And so this romance of theirs is predicated on the idea that it isn't real, that it's a fairy tale romance. It's a fantasy for them both that is separate from the lives from their real lives. Daisy Renton's real life is the Palace Bar. That's the reality of her situation. She will live out her life at the Palace Bar, probably get coerced into prostitution, and live a significantly lower class life than Gerald Croft will. Gerald Croft's life plan is to marry Sheila Burling and to merge his business with Burling's. So these two characters' real lives are laid out for them, and this romance, this relationship, is the fantasy. And both of them realise that this relationship isn't going to last, because socially it would be unacceptable for Gerald to have that relationship with Eva Smith. Eventually, that relationship is going to fall apart. That said, I think Gerald has genuine affection for Eva Smith. I think he genuinely does love her, even though he won't admit it to himself. He says, when asked directly if he loves Eva Smith, he says, "It's hard to say. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me." And I think that's because for Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as the character name that she's going by at that point, that relationship represents far more for her than it does for Gerald. For Eva Smith, it's the possibility of a better life, even though she knows that it is a fantasy, that it isn't something that would ever really happen. For Gerald Croft, it represents the ability for him to be a knight in shining armour, to be a moral human being, even though he knows that when that ends, he's going to have to go back to doing what the capitalist society that he belongs to expects of him, which is to to be self-interested and to marry within a certain social group.
That was our actor Richard Green. Thanks, Rich. So I hope this Q&A session has been a benefit to you and you can draw from this information. In the meantime, carry on enjoying and studying an inspector calls, and we wish you all the best in your exams.